If you're curious about how astrology would predict death, I'm going to show you one succinct technique given by the famous 13th century astrologer Mantreshwar. Basically, the technique is very simple. He says to predict death when blank transits blank. So the first thing we want to clarify is, what does he mean by transit? He certainly means transits by degrees, and it seems like he means by triangular degree, by trine, but actually really what he means is by geometric degree. So transits that are forming squares or trines, and the square includes the opposition and the conjunction. Now, the next thing to ask is, how do we fill in these blanks? When blank transits blank, well, let's fill in the first blank with a planet. And out of the 7 classical planets, Mantreshwar is not going to use Venus, Mercury, or Mars. The logic here seems to be that he's going to use the slowest transits, Jupiter and Saturn, to get a zone, like a wide-angle zone of time in which to predict the death, and then he's going to use the fastest moving planets, the Sun and the Moon, to narrow it down within that zone. So now we have 4 conditions to look for. Saturn transiting something, Jupiter transiting something, the Sun transiting something, and the Moon transiting something. So you might want to ask, how do we use these 4 together? The basic instinct, the way that the neophyte usually feels about how these techniques work, is that these are OR operators. In other words, the statement OR connects these. But probably the most important thing you could ever do to improve your own practice or hobby of astrology is to get rid of the concept that techniques work with the OR operator. They work with the AND operator. So in other words, we're looking for Saturn to transit something and Jupiter to transit something simultaneously, while the Sun is transiting something and so is the Moon. That's how you can make an accurate prediction about something. Now, you don't have to have all of the conditions met. You use a weighting system to judge a sense of confidence of how much you're confident that this event will happen or how seriously this event will unfold. And you don't have to apply equal weights to everything. I mean, honestly, the transits of the slower planets like Saturn and Jupiter should be given more seriousness than the transits of the faster planets like the Sun and the Moon. Otherwise, you're going to be dying every month or every year, because the Moon will transit every point every month and the Sun will transit every point every year. So really, the optimal way to use a technique like this is, like I said, you use the slow planets like Jupiter and Saturn to get a window in which this event, death in this case, is possible. And then you use the fast planets to find out within that window where's the most likely time that it's going to happen. So now let's ask, what about the other blank, the blanks on the right side of all these formulas? How do we fill in those? What points are going to be transited by these 4 planets? Well, the most important point is the 8th Lord. That will apply for all 4 of these planets. We want to look for Saturn transiting the 8th Lord, Jupiter transiting the 8th Lord, Sun transiting the 8th Lord, and the Moon transiting the 8th Lord. The rationale behind that is fairly obvious, because the 8th house, and thus Lord, controls our vitality and our longevity. The next point that can be transited by these planets to indicate death is the Dracon's 8th Lord. I'll explain that in this video carefully what it is. The rationale behind using the Dracon specifically is that, like the 8th house or the 3rd house, it is also a significator of our vitality and our strength and our longevity. But the Dracon 8th Lord is only going to be used, according to Mantreshwar, with the slow planets, Jupiter and Saturn. Now, he also is going to consider some return transits significant. So when the planet transits itself, he considers this significant for Saturn's return and for the Sun's return. For the Moon, he almost considers the return significant, but instead he wants the Moon transiting the Sun to be taken seriously for timing death. And for the Sun, the 1st Lord is also significant when the Sun transits the 1st Lord. The rationale behind that is also pretty obvious, because the 1st house and thus Lord signifies your body. Similar to that, the Dracon's 1st Lord is significant for Jupiter to transit. Whew. Okay, that is actually the complete list, however. So we're done. We did a lot of work figuring that out. That's the complete list of the significant points to be transited by these 4 planets. The caveat about the sun's transit points is that they have to do with the 12th subdivisional chart, not the main chart. That's the Dvadashamsa. I'll explain that a little bit later. Before that, I want to mention this important point that Mantreshwar says, is that these points can and must be calculated both in reference to the ascendant, as we would normally do, and also in reference to the moon, as they used to do quite often. So what this winds up doing is giving us 2 sets of all of these points. So this is what the theory looks like. This is what the technique looks like. We're looking for Saturn to transit certain points, Jupiter to transit certain points, etc., all together, all at the same time. Now that's enough theory to fill up your brain for a while. Before you forget it all, let's try to put it into practice. Let's look at how we would do this on a real chart. I like to use Bruce Lee's chart because it's an interesting chart and his death is also quite interesting. So let's start to figure out what some of these transit points really are in somebody's actual chart. For example, the sun is supposed to be significant if it transits the first lord. So what's the first lord? Well, for Bruce Lee, his ascendant is in Sagittarius, and the lord of Sagittarius is Jupiter, so his first lord is Jupiter. So the sun would be significant when it transits Jupiter. And what about the moon's first lord? That's also quite simple. His moon is in Scorpio. Mars rules Scorpio, so his moon's first lord is Mars. Now how about his 8th lord, which is the most significant transit point? You just count 8 signs from the ascendant, from the rising sign. So his ascendant is in Sagittarius, so start there and count 8 signs and you wind up at Cancer. Cancer belongs to the moon, so the 8th lord for Bruce Lee is the moon. And how would you find the 8th lord for his moon? Like from his moon instead of from his ascendant? Just do the same thing you did, but count from the moon instead of the ascendant. So his moon is in Scorpio. Start counting from there. 8 signs later, you wind up in Gemini. Gemini belongs to Mercury, so Mercury is his moon's 8th lord. And now we have sorted out a lot of the actual points that need to be transited to indicate his death. The next point that we need to sort out has to do with the subdivisional chart. Is the Dracon's lords. The Dracon's 8th and 1st lords. So before we do that, let me just quickly explain to you what the heck the Dracon even is. So start with the regular zodiac and divide each of those zodiac signs into 3 equal parts. So you wind up with each part being 10 degrees long. Then you assign identity to each one of those divisions like this. Now it's easier to show this to you than to explain it, so watch along here. The first division of any sign has the same ruler as the sign itself. The remaining 2 divisions have the rulers of the triplicity lords in the order in which they appear. Now, how do we find the 8th lord in the Dracon? Well, let's do it for Bruce Lee. His ascendant is at 6 degrees of Sagittarius. So rotate all of the house cusps and then overlay the Dracon divisions, and you'll see that his 8th cusp is in the moon's Dracon. So the moon is his Dracon 8th lord. Now, if you don't have these kind of graphics to work with, there's another way to do it, which you might even find simpler. Here it is. Since his ascendant is at 6 degrees, that's less than 10 degrees, so it's in the first Dracon. And that means that every one of his house cusps is in the first Dracon of whatever sign it is. So since his 8th house is Cancer, his 8th Dracon is in the first Dracon of Cancer, and that would be the moon's Dracon. Since we're here looking at the Dracon, to get the Dracon's first lord, it's very easy. Just look at the Dracon that the ascendant falls in. It belongs to Jupiter, so his first Dracon lord is Jupiter. Now, how would you do this for his moon? Same thing. His moon is at 11 degrees of Scorpio, so rotate the cusps to 11 degrees Scorpio. Look at the 8th cusp, and you can easily see that it belongs to Venus. So Venus is the Dracon's 8th lord for his moon. And similarly, it's very easy now to find out the moon's first lord in the Dracon. It's Jupiter, as you can see here. Okay, so we figured out all of the transit points. So we filled in all the blanks on the right side of this formula for predicting death. But there's one little caveat, is that for the sun's transits, they have to be towards the points in the D12 chart, the 12th divisional chart, Dvadashamsa. The logic for that is that the 12th divisional is just like the 12th house, so it has a lot to do with dying and reincarnation and so forth. So let me show you how to do that, starting with a quick explanation of what the Dvadashamsa is. Again, you just take the regular zodiac and you subdivide each sign. This time you subdivide it into 12 equal parts. How do you recognize the identity of these 12 parts? The first part of any sign is the same as the sign itself, and then the rest go in natural order from that. So the first 12th of Aries is Aries, and the second one is Taurus, third is Gemini, etc. The first 12th of Taurus is Taurus, and the next one is Gemini, then Cancer, etc., and so on. If you divide 30 degrees by 12, you get 2.5. So each one of these 12th parts is 2.5 degrees long, and that's how you know the borders, where they begin and end. Now that we're refreshed and clear about what this Dvadashamsa thing is, we're ready to use it. So let's try to find the 12th divisional point for Bruce Lee's 8th Lord. So his 8th Lord is the moon. His moon is at 11 degrees and 24 minutes of Scorpio. So just look at that on a Dvadashamsa chart, and you can see that the moon is in Pisces Dvadashamsa. But it's not that easy, because the technique is calling for transits by degree and is asking specifically for the degree from the Dvadashamsa. And this is a fairly sophisticated and refined usage of subdivisional charts. Let me explain it to you as quickly as possible without getting confusing. To find the degree position of any planet in any amsha, you first of all take the actual position of the planet. So his moon is at 11 degrees 24 minutes. And then you take the degree position of the border of that. So the border of the 12th division that the moon is in started at 10 degrees. Now just subtract 10 from the moon's position, and you get 1 degree 24 minutes. And convert that to minutes. So it's just like converting hours to minutes. It's 60 minutes per degree. So 1 degree and 24 minutes is 84 minutes. Now figure out how many minutes are in the full slice of the division. The Dvadashamsa 12ths are each 2.5 degrees long, right? So how many minutes is that? 150. Now what you do is just divide 84 by 150 to figure out the percentage that the moon has gone into this slice. And then once you have that percentage, you just multiply that by 30 to translate it into a 30-based degree, which is what we're looking for. So when you go through all that, you figure out that his moon's Dvadashamsa Sputa, the degree that the moon is at in the Dvadashamsa, is 16 degrees 48 minutes. Let's just say 17 degrees. And that's what we need to be able to use this technique for the sun. So you have to do this for the other 4 points as well, for Mercury, Jupiter, Mars, and the sun in Bruce Lee's case. Let's just do this super fast. Now, we actually know everything that we need to know to be able to use this death prediction technique on Bruce Lee's chart and see how it works. So let's get his chart up here on the screen and put his planets into place. Let's also add the D12 points. So the D12 position of his moon, his 8th Lord, is at 17 degrees Pisces. The moon's 8th Lord, Mercury, in the D12 is at 3 degrees of Taurus. So let's put that on this chart. Jupiter, the first Lord of the Dracon, is at 0 degrees of Leo. Mars, the moon's first Lord, is at 25 degrees of Sagittarius. And the sun is at 3 degrees of Aquarius. So now that we have those points on the screen, let's look at the transits that happened on the day he died, which is July 20th, 1973. Let's start with Saturn's transits. So Saturn was at 28 degrees of Gemini on that day. What is it transiting? In fact, it is actually trine to his Venus. And Venus is significant for predicting death by Saturn's trine because it's his Dracon's eighth lord from the moon. So that worked. Also, this Saturn at 28 degrees is almost exactly opposite from his Dwadashamsa point from Mars, which he didn't mention specifically as being relevant to Saturn's transit, but it's something to think about. Similarly, Saturn at 28 degrees of Gemini is basically square to his Dwadashamsa moon, which is the eighth lord, because that is at 17 degrees of Pisces. Again, he didn't mention that specifically as important for Saturn's transit, but it's not something to overlook. Now let's think about Jupiter's transits, because we're looking for more of these transits to happen at once, and then we get more and more serious about our feeling that this is going to indicate the person's death. So where was Jupiter on July 20th, 1973? It was at 18 degrees in Aquarius, and it was retrograde. So what does that do? How does that interact with Bruce Lee's chart? Well, it's pretty square to his natal Jupiter. And that was significant according to Mantreshwar, because Jupiter is his D3 first lord from the ascendant and the moon. This also means that it's square to both his moon and Mercury. So this really seems to be validating Mantreshwar's technique. Additionally, Jupiter being at 18 degrees of Aquarius puts it pretty close to opposite of its own Dwadashamsa point, which isn't something that he said to look for specifically with Jupiter, but is something to think about. Now, let's look at the fast-moving planets. Let's look at the sun's transits on July 20th, 1973. Remember, the sun is supposed to be transiting these red points from the Dwadashamsa. Where was it on July 20th? It's at 27 degrees of Cancer, of course. And what is very close to 27 degrees of Cancer, his Dwadashamsa Jupiter, which is the first lord from his ascendant. What else is the sun doing at this position? Well, it's pretty well exactly opposite to its own position in the Dwadashamsa. So it's transiting its own Dwadashamsa position. Also, it's forming a square with the Dwadashamsa position of Mercury, which is significant because Mercury is the eighth lord for the moon. And also, it's forming a trine with the Dwadashamsa position of the moon, which is significant because the moon is the eighth lord. Also, Mantreshwar didn't mention this, but it is transiting the natal Venus, moon, and Mercury. Finally, let's look and see where the moon was on July 20th, 1973. It was at 18 degrees of Pisces. Well, that's almost exactly where its own Dwadashamsa position is. Mantreshwar didn't tell us that specifically, but again, using what he was talking about, it seems pretty significant. What he did say was that when the moon transits the eighth lord from itself or from the ascendant, that's a significant indicator of death. And guess what the moon was doing on July 20th, 1973? It was trine to Bruce Lee's eighth lord and his moon's eighth lord. So look at all these transits that matched what Mantreshwar said to look for. That's the significant point. You found a lot of them lining up. That's when you can say, yes, he's probably going to die or have a very significant problem on this date. So this is just one of the many excellent techniques that Mantreshwar gives us in Paladipika, which I've been translating and sharing with you on this YouTube channel for over 2 years, I think. And I have published chapters 1 through 4. You can find those links to those books on my website. Also at my website, you can find the reports that I offer for your chart. So find a link to that in the description below. Thank you so much.